Let's begin.
Hey there, scary story fanatics. Welcome back to Cleaving Thought from Bone with your host, Sociopathic. Everyone says authority is something to be respected, but it's hard to give such to something completely untrustworthy. So, if you're looking to get to the bottom of things and root out injustice, settle in for part 1 of a 2-part series that Doughboy420 likes to call Police Brutality Part 1.
The cop killer, as the media called him, had been terrorizing the small city of Birmingham for quite some time now. The name sparked thoughts in Detective John Romero's mind. They'd obviously gotten the name from the iced tea hit by the same title. It seemed appropriate for the situation. For over a month, this assailant had been killing police officers, and now nearly a dozen of Birmingham's finest were in the ground because of this maniac. Detective Romero sat and thought about how all this began, about how he was assigned to the case, and about where their primary suspect could possibly be. Thomas Malcolm Keene, African-American, 6'1", medium build. Last seen wearing a light gray hooded sweatshirt and blue jeans, considered to be armed and dangerous. Detective Romero went over the statistics in his head over and over again. Something in him was uneasy as he thought back to how all of this started. It was a cold, autumn night. The leaves had started to turn and a storm was rolling in. All was calm. It was the calm before the storm. Thomas Keene had a warrant out for his arrest for cultivation and sale of illegal drugs. An informant dropped his name to us, and he was suspected of growing large quantities of marijuana in his garage and was in possession of several kilos of cocaine. The BPD had been looking for the source of the recent surge of cocaine in Birmingham, and now they believed that they had found it. They planned the raid for days in advance, and they were sure that they had everything down. Officers Darren Wilson, Bob Kent, and Richard Olson would breach the front door and enter the house, followed by officers Kimberly Blake and Joel Thompson. They would clear the front of the house, while officers Mitchell Kelly, Eddie Reed, and Amber McNeil entered the back door. Officers Randall Matthews, Tim Brown, Marion Harper, and Jim Woods were supposed to scout the perimeter of the house to prevent his escape. All should have gone smoothly. They were all trained professionals. The lot of them jumped into 2 SWAT trucks and set off for the address of Mr. Keene during the early morning hours. They were all a bit tired. They'd already worked an 8-hour shift, and now were about halfway through their second shift. They were all on edge because of what the informant had told them. The informant came into the station in the possession of marijuana with intent to distribute. A few BPD officers had picked him up for being drunk in public and exposing himself. They were called in because he was urinating in a bush right in front of a McDonald's. When they searched him, they found a ½ ounce of marijuana that was split into 2 bags. One bag could have been argued as personal use, but with it being split into 2 bags, it was considered intent to distribute. He was an informant, so they gave him the chance to tell them where he had gotten the drugs from. He said that he was invited to a party at Mr. Keen's home, and while he was there, Mr. Keen sold him the half-ounce of marijuana that he was arrested with. He said that Mr. Keen invited him in to the garage to weigh up a bag to sell him. Inside the garage, he said he saw dozens of marijuana plants in various stages of growth and harvest, and beside the locked garage door, he'd seen a cache of automatic and semi-automatic weapons and boxes of ammunition, and next to that were 3 big bags of what he assumed to be cocaine. It appeared that Mr. Keen was armed to the teeth to protect his operation. The officers checked up on the story and let the informant go free with a fine. Thomas Keen had previously been arrested for driving while intoxicated and had also been charged with possession of a small quantity of marijuana while he was in college in his early 20s, over a decade ago. Aside from a parking ticket or two, his record had been clean since, but this was enough evidence for a judge to issue a warrant to allow the BPD to conduct a full SWAT raid into the home of Mr. Keen. They were sure that he was the source of the recent surge of cocaine that was being found in the pockets of rowdy teens in the area, and even down into the neighboring state of Pennsylvania. After a short while, the officers arrived at the home of Mr. Keen. The 2 SWAT vehicles pulled right into his yard, one of them running over a small plastic big wheel, but they paid no mind. The dozen of them piled out of the 2 vehicles and swarmed the house. Officers Wilson, Kent, and Olson walked up onto the front deck and approached the large wooden door that was painted a calming blue, a blue that matched the trim of the house. They were followed by Officers Blake and Thompson, who stood between the front door and large bay windows in the front of the home. Officers Woods and Matthews watched the garage door and the right side of the house, while Officers Brown and Harper watched the left side of the house, all of them waiting to stop a possible escape attempt. The 3 remaining officers, Reed, Kelly, and McNeil, went around to the back of the house and prepared to bust down the rear door. 3, 2, 1. Officer Thompson smashed out one of the front bay windows with the butt of his gun and tossed a flashbang into the house. It went off. The officers kicked both the front and back doors in and rushed inside, guns drawn, moving room to room, clearing the house. All was going according to plan when Officers Kent and Olson found Thomas Keen in an upstairs bedroom. He was still in his PJs and didn't know what was going on. They caught him asleep in his bed. The officers arrested him as the others cleared the rest of the house. It was when Officers Reed and Kelly kicked open a door on the first floor that the operation went sour. The 2 of them kicked open the door and saw a kid pointing a gun at them. They followed their first instinct and opened fire. It was only after the other officers had come rushing to their aid that they realized what they had done. The gun the kid was holding was a toy. A little, gray machine gun with an orange cap on the end. Those 2 idiots shot first and asked questions later, and a young kid was dead because of it. That's what started this whole mess. But it just got worse from there. The only thing the officers found in the house was half gram of marijuana, street value, $5. The informant had lied to them. Thomas Keen wasn't a big-time drug dealer. There weren't dozens of marijuana plants in the house. There were no guns in the garages, no arsenal, no ammo, no coke. Nothing. Just a bag of pot and now a father who had lost a child. There was obvious negligence in the department, but they didn't want to hear any of that. They arrested Mr. Keene anyway, and put Officers Mitchell Kelly and Eddie Reed on paid administrative leave, while the case went under investigation. The two of them packed up their families and left town to go stay with relatives, to wait for the commotion to die down. In the following days, there was an uproar by the public and Mr. Keene as well, who had been released on bail, both wanting answers for the tragic death of the young Michael Damian Keene at the hands of the Birmingham Police Department. No answers came, and one day, Mr. Keene just stopped going to the rallies for answers that he had put together himself. Then, shortly after that, the killings started. The first one to go was Thomas Keene's arresting officer, Richard Olson. Rich was on his way to being relieved from duty so that he could go home when he got a call from dispatch. There was a robbery in progress at the gas station on Main Street, so he rushed over to the scene. When he got there, he found that the gas station was completely fine. It had just been another prank call. They got them all the time. He shrugged it off and returned to his cruiser, where he contacted dispatch and let them know that it was a false alarm. That was the last anyone ever heard from Officer Olson. His police cruiser was found the next day, left abandoned by the side of the road, the door open, and the battery dead. The car was filled with blood and an obvious struggle that had taken place. The police began an all-out manhunt to find Officer Richard Olson, but they didn't have to search long. The following day, they found his body had washed up on the shore of the river. He'd been burnt to a crisp, beyond any recognition. The only way that they could tell it was him was through dental records, and his own police badge shoved down his throat. This was a message to the BPD. This guy wanted revenge, and he wasn't fucking around. The entire station got together to honor their fallen brother. Everyone from the chief, to the detectives, to traffic cops, to the janitor, all of them taking turns telling stories in remembrance of Officer Olson, and all of them swearing to find the one responsible for what happened to him. I remember this one time, my wife and I invited Richie over for a cookout. Officer Eddie began to speak. He was pretty drunk that day, and he handed me his keys and was like, "Eddie, could you imagine me being pulled over for drunk driving? A cop? Me? I think you'd better hold on to these," he said, before he went in and passed out on my couch, getting a laugh from everyone. "I'll miss you, Richie," he said, getting a depressed agreement from all in the room.
I always hated how he would always say crap like, "Man, I loved you in Videodrome," or "Hey, Lloyd," and I would always remind him that I wasn't in Videodrome. I wasn't in Cop, even though I am one, and I am Jim Woods, not James.
Officer Woods joked.
But he'd always be like, yeah, whatever. You were in Vampires, right? Man, that goofy son of a bitch would never stop with that. Always had to pick on the new guy.
Jim reminisced.
This one time we went out to the bar with Amber, Tim, and I.
Officer Mitchell Kelly said.
We only planned on stopping in for a little drink after work before heading home. That guy kept us there until closing. 2 o'clock in the morning, we helped Tim out of the taxi to his house. His wife's waiting there at the door. I have never seen her so angry. Oh my god. We thought we were gonna have to arrest her on the spot to keep her from killing him right then and there. She was screaming, lights were turning on in people's houses all over the neighborhood. Dogs are barking. Amber had to direct neighbors back into their houses. She was pissed. I mean pissed. Richie walks up to her and says, "Oh, Bev, it's alright. We kept him safe and wouldn't let him do anything bad. We're looking out for both of you. Have a good night." And he just gave her a big, drunken hug and stumbled back into the car, leaving her speechless. Tim slept on the couch that night. The yelling stopped, and his wife didn't kill him.
Officer Kelly shared his memory with his friends.
"I'll miss you, man. And we're gonna catch the sorry piece of shit that did this to you. I promise you that."
He swore vengeance for his fallen friend, getting a cheer of agreement from everyone in attendance. They were all hurt, and they were all furious. They promised to find the one responsible and put them away, no matter what. But soon, the dire situation set in for them. Another day passed, and another body was discovered. Officer Kimberly Blake was found lying face down in a ditch by a gas station off the highway. The way she died didn't make sense, though. She and her sister Amanda had gone out to the bar to celebrate Amanda's birthday. They both drank a little too much when Amanda decided to take a cab home. Amanda hitched a ride in the cab and went home to sleep it off for the night. And Kim stayed at the bar to party for a while longer before she left as well. After that, God only knows what happened after that. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. She was found laying face down in the ditch, her badge shoved down her throat, causing it to bulge out like she had an Adam's apple. She was frozen solid and still cold when they found her body. She died from exposure. She froze to death. The medical examiner figured she must have been kept in a freezer because the recent temperature was far too warm for her to die of exposure naturally. 2 more bodies turned up a week later, both on the same day. Mitchell Kelly was found by a quarry worker in the old Kilmer Stone Quarry. At least, they thought it was Officer Kelly. His hands and feet had been removed, and the remainder of his body had been crushed by stone. His face was damaged beyond recognition. There was nothing left of it. And the only way they could tell it was Officer Kelly was from the calling card of the cop killer. His badge was stuffed down his throat, just like the others. He was last seen 2 days prior when he went out for groceries and never returned. His neighbor was supposed to meet up with him that afternoon to talk to him about their garden, but when Mitchell Kelly didn't show up and he could not be reached, the neighbor decided to contact his coworkers at the police station. Thomas Keene had killed one of the 2 men that were ultimately responsible for the death of his son. The other body belonged to Officer Tim Brown. He was found in the same river as the first victim, and nearly the same place as well. They'd probably been dumped at the same location, too. An autopsy determined that Officer Brown had been drowned, but that he had not drowned in the river in which he was found. The water in his lungs didn't match the river's water. He'd been drowned somewhere else and then dumped into the river, and just like the other victims, his badge was stuffed far down his throat, nearly causing his throat to split from it being forced down. It was around this time that Detective Romero was assigned to the cop killer case. There was a serial killer out there, and he was targeting cops. 4 were dead, and several more would come over the coming days. A few more days passed, and 3 more victims were found. Officer Joel Thompson was off duty, and he decided to go have a few drinks at the bar down the road from the precinct, the same one that they all frequented together. After having a few drinks, nature called, but the bathroom was locked, and he really had to go, so he did what he had to do. He made his way outside and around into the alley beside the bar to relieve himself. Security cameras in the alley revealed that while Officer Thompson was urinating, he was approached from behind by a man wearing a light gray hooded sweatshirt, the same sweatshirt that Mr. Keene had last been seen wearing. The man they believed to be Thomas Keene retrieved an electric stun baton from under his sweater and held it at the side of Joel's neck before pulling the trigger. The security footage showed that Joel Thompson convulsed as the hooded man electrocuted him. After a few moments of constant electrocution, Officer Thompson began to smoke and his flesh began to singe and become charred. When the trigger was released and Officer Thompson fell to the ground, still slightly convulsing due to the nerves in his body and the remaining electricity pulsing through them, the man stood over him, reached into his pocket, and held Joel Thompson's mouth open before stuffing something inside and down his throat. It was his badge. The cop killer had already stolen Officer Thompson's badge, probably from his home. However, no evidence was found in his home. Nothing was wrong. Nothing was out of place. No one knew how the cop killer obtained Officer Thompson's badge. The next victim was Darren Wilson. He was shopping with his wife at Karen Square Mall, a 10-story building located on Colonial Street in Birmingham. They were on the 5th floor of the building when Darren told his wife that he was going to the bathroom. After about 20 minutes, Mrs. Wilson became concerned. Darren was upstairs at the time. He was being forced onto the roof by the cop killer. The security cameras in the shopping center showed that he was taken at gunpoint by a man wearing a light, gray, hooded sweatshirt, and just like before, he kept his face down so he couldn't be seen. They went out onto the roof and walked out of view of the one remaining camera that was pointing at the roof access door. A few minutes after they disappeared from sight, the shoppers were startled by the sound of a loud screaming from outside, followed by a loud thud sound. Officer Wilson had been thrown off the roof and had fallen about 120 feet to the pavement below. A crowd gathered on the street around his body. He was laying at the edge of the sidewalk, his upper torso in the street. He'd obviously been thrown from the building. The pavement was cracked beneath him, and he laid in a pool of blood. Most of his bones had been shattered. His wife had made her way to the 1st floor, wondering what all the commotion was. She found her husband's body laying dead in the street. No one should ever have to see that. The poor woman. Detective Romero thought to himself. The final victim to be found that day was Marion Harper. She'd been jogging through the park with her husband, Jake, the day before, and had stopped to tie her shoe. When her husband looked back, she was gone. She was there one moment and gone the next, in just seconds. Her body was found less than 24 hours later by a highway patrol officer. She was laying in the middle of the highway, staring up into the sky. She had burns around her mouth, and it was found that she had died from asphyxiation. It was determined that her mouth was held over the exhaust pipe of the car. The hot exhaust burnt both her lips and her cheeks as she suffocated on the car's exhaust fumes. Just like all the others, her neck bulged from the badge within it. Detective Romero began to notice a pattern. Another calling card, aside from the police badges stuffed into their throats. The cop killer was killing them each in completely different ways. But there was a connection. There was a pattern. Officer Olson burned to death. Fire. Officer Blake was frozen. Ice. Kelly was crushed to death by boulders. Earth. Tim Brown was drowned. Water. Officer Thompson was electrocuted. Electricity. Wilson was thrown off a building. Air. Officer Harper was forced to inhale a car's exhaust. Gas. Thomas Keene was killing them using different elements. What elements next? Detective Romero thought to himself. He didn't have to wait long to find out. That very night, Detective Romero was awoken by the sound of his cell phone ringing. The phone rang, and the vibrations from it caused it to rattle across the nightstand upon which it sat. He reached over for his phone, still half asleep. The sleepy detective looked at the screen to see who was calling. He quickly awoke when he saw it was the department and immediately answered. "Hello?" he said, in a bit of a daze. The voice on the other end belonged to the dispatcher.
Detective Romero?
The woman on the other end asked. "Speaking," he answered.
They found another body.
She said. "Where?" Romero asked in a concerned tone.
The old foundry by the river.
She answered.
They think it's Bob.
She continued. "I'm sorry," Detective Romero told her. "Take care," he finished.
Thank you. You too,
she said, before hanging up the phone. Detective Romero just jumped out of bed, got dressed, and out the door he went. He rushed to the foundry, where the body was recently found. The foundry was an old, run-down building that had been abandoned for a long time. It used to be an iron smelting factory long ago, but now it was falling apart. The roof had caved in some places, and every single window in the building was missing or broken because of neighborhood hooligans. Now it was mostly used as a garbage dump for anyone that could get away with it. It sat beside an old stream that emptied out into the Susquehanna River, which Romero figured couldn't be very good for the environment. When Detective Romero arrived, the place was covered with officers and CSIs. The media was being kept off the scene, but barely. Everyone was clamoring to know if the deceased was the latest victim of the cop killer. Romero made his way down to the body and was immediately appalled by both the sight and smell of what he had found. The body was melted and burned beyond recognition. The flesh had been burned away to reveal his skeleton in places. He had half a face. The other half was melted down to the bone. It was definitely Bob Kent, and the badge that could be seen within his hollowed-out throat corroborated the story. Officer Kent's flesh had been burned away by some kind of chemical. It was most likely some form of acid. Another officer that Thomas Keene felt he was wronged by, and another element added to his list. Detective Romero scanned the scene for any clues as to where Keene had gone. Then, something caught the detective's eye by the river. Romero walked around the corner of the foundry and made his way down close to the river. There, by an old drainage ditch that ran beneath the foundry, was another body. Another victim of the cop killer? Detective Romero thought. But upon closer examination, he found something even more unsettling. There he was, laying in the reeds. It looked like Thomas Keene, but it couldn't have been. He had to have been dead for days, maybe even weeks. His skin was rotting away, and he'd been picked at by the wildlife. But he could still be recognized was Mr. Keene. Upon closer examination, Romero found a bullet hole in his chest. A bullet to the heart? Romero whispered to himself, confused as to how Thomas Keene could possibly be here. Thomas Keene couldn't have committed those murders. He'd been dead from the beginning. And if he wasn't the cop killer, then who was?
Well, it seems that if you're looking for the truth, a good place to start may be at the beginning. After all expectations have been subverted for now. And who lies at the bottom of it all? Well, stop by again next weekend for an epic conclusion. And until then, remember to like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications so I can catch you all again next Saturday.
Social media can be very unpredictable, especially regarding horror content. If this content gets removed, all new content will be simultaneously presented on various websites provided in the description to this video. Make sure to follow me in other digital spaces so that you never miss out on the terror. Also, if you like this video, make sure to leave a comment and hit the like button. It helps the channel a lot. If you're new to the channel and you enjoy what's here, consider hitting that subscribe button and the notification bell so that you never miss an upload. Writing is a dream of mine, and it's all of you that make that dream come true.